On This Week in Enterprise Tech, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler takes the cable industry to task, or does he? Also, Steve Gibson stops by to talk about proper computing in the cloud. Twiet on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twiet. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 106, recorded September 8th, 2014. ISPs, net neutrality, the cloud, and other nightmares. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Prosper. Prosper is a peer-to-peer lending marketplace that connects people who are looking to borrow money with those who have money to lend. Visit prosper.com/twit and receive a $50 Visa prepaid card when you get a loan. And by IT Pro TV. Are you looking to upgrade your IT skills or prepare for certification? IT Pro TV offers engaging and informative tutorials streamed to your Roku, computer, or mobile device. For 30% off the lifetime of your account, go to itpro.tv/enterprise and use the code ENTERPRISE30. And by TechServe, the world's largest independent Apple retailer and professional services provider. Go to techserve.com/twiet-7sins to get access to the free ebook on the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment. Welcome to Twiet, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And of course, I'm joined by my regular cast of characters, starting with Mr. Brian Chee, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii, who has a migrating dog. It looks like Grommet has made its way onto your shoulder. Brian, how is Hawaii?
Hawaii is just dandy. In fact, I've been trolling Indiegogo and found a new project called Hullabaloo, where a group of Disney animators are trying to preserve the art of 2D animation. It's steampunk.
It is, and you know what? It's kind of it's special to see an old-style animation. So I love 3D animation. It is the future. It's the way, but it's nice to admire the artist the way he used to be. Also joining us is Mr. Curtis Franklin from Information Week Radio. Great to see you, Curtis. How are things over on the right coast?
Things are beautiful on the right coast. Last week we were out in the desert, and I tell you what, it's good to be back to a place where the warm air envelops you in its soft humidity.
Yes, also known as sweaty drawers. Let's get right into the news with the blips. First, well, do you want to see an internet devoid of net neutrality? Well, this coming Wednesday, you can. Kinda. A group of popular websites, including Reddit, Etsy, Boing Boing, Vimeo, and WordPress, will display spinning wheel icons as a symbolic protest to the FCC plans to institute internet fast lanes. Though they won't actually be slowing their page loads, the icons will be accompanied by messages to email or call U.S. policymakers in support of net neutrality rules, just 5 days before the deadline for second-round comments on the FCC's proposal.
Retina implants allows the blind to see. Doctors at the University of Southern California have developed a device that can help the blind see again. What you want to think of are the now common cochlear implants for hearing that allows the deaf to hear. The preliminary device is basically a 60-bit grid that would probably be akin to a low-resolution Minecraft image. Processing is done via a belt-worn computer and fed back to a wireless receiver saddling the eyeball. While not true sight, it should give the blind a way to see edges so that getting around could become dramatically easier.
Microsoft knows what you need. Microsoft has launched Delve, the latest member of the Office 365 family. Now, Delve will scan its way through all of your OneDrive, SharePoint, and Exchange data to create a Facebook-like feed that shows you what's important, at least according to a super whiz-bang set of algorithms Microsoft is going to employ. Microsoft promises to add feeds and data to Delve as time goes on, making it your one-stop concierge for everything that matters in your professional life. Hey, What could possibly go wrong?
Are you ready for a speed boost? Well, you just might get it. In cooperation with Fujitsu and NEC, Japanese telecom giant NTT has tested a technology that uses quote-unquote digital backward propagation signal processing to reduce the amount of equipment required for a given long-distance link and increase the amount of data that they can push over a single wavelength on a single fiber from 100 gigabits per second to 400 gigabits per second. Currently installed tech allows them to run multiple wavelengths over multiple fibers bundled into a single backbone link that can carry 8 terabits per second. With the new tech, they can push 24 terabits per second over the same link. Though it will take some time to make the tech commercially viable, it has the potential to significantly decrease the cost of backbone links while dramatically increasing effective throughput. In other words, puny gigabit. Well, when we come back, we're going to be getting into some hot and heated discussion about some net neutrality legislation and brouhaha. But before that, let's take just a moment to thank the first sponsor of the Twilight Riot, and it's Prosper. Now, what would you do if you knew that in 72 hours you could have up to $35,000 to cover your needs? What would you do with it? Would you consolidate your high-rate credit card? Would you start a business? Would you finally do that home improvement project that you've been putting off year after year? Well, what if I told you that by filling out an easy online application and providing a few details, you could see a rate online instantly without ever stepping foot in a bank? Well, folks, that's not fantasy, that's Prosper. Prosper offers low fixed rates, unsecured personal loans, and has multi-term year terms available. I remember a long time ago when my computer consultation company grew past my resources, I needed a cash infusion, which meant I needed a loan from a bank, and that process was as demeaning as it was confusing. Showing one bank manager after another that my business really wasn't just cash positive, but profit flush with a need for just enough cash to fulfill my existing contracts. Well, I wouldn't have to go through that today. I wish Prosper had existed back then, because then I could have saved myself the wear and tear of the bank shuffle and gotten the cash that I needed immediately. Prosper is an innovative peer-to-peer lending process, Silicon Valley's answer to a more modern, community-based personal loan. There are no outrageous fees, no raising interest rates, and yes, you'll never set foot in a bank. Prosper has more than 2 million members, lenders, and borrowers, and over $1 billion in funded loans. Folks, this is the future. This is peer-to-peer lending. Prosper connects people who need money with those who have it to loan. It's really that simple. It's just baffling that this isn't the way that we all do business. So go to prosper.com/twit to check your rate instantly without affecting your credit score. For a limited time, Prosper is offering Twit viewers a $50 Visa prepaid card when you get a loan. Go to prosper.com/twit. That's a special site just for our viewers. Up to $35,000 in just 3 days and a $50 Visa prepaid card. Go to prosper.com/twit. Prosper.com/twit. And we thank Prosper for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, gentlemen, let's get right to it. We've got an update on the net neutrality saga, this one involving Tom Wheeler. Now, Tom Wheeler, the former cable TV lobbyist and the current chairman of the FCC, fired a shot across the ISPs' collective bow with a public declaration that the United States market for broadband internet is not competitive enough. Now, Wheeler struck at the oft-quoted ISP lobbyist dream statistic that 75% of Americans can choose between 2 or 3 ISPs for delivering broadband connectivity. That's been absolutely crucial for the way that they proceed. They've been saying, look, there's plenty of competition. You don't need to regulate. You don't need to legislate. You don't need to give up-and-comers any sort of advantage because we've already got competition. Well, Wheeler said, not so fast. He suggested that DSL delivering 4 megabits per second or less, which is pretty much most of DSL, is not broadband. And that if you consider that, 55% of the U.S. households have only one option for high-speed broadband, and 20% have none. Now, Chee, let me throw this over to you first, because this is it's gonna be a little bit of a surprise for people who think Tom Wheeler is just the toady for the cable industry. But early when in his term, when he was just confirmed, there were some people in the cable lobbyist sect who were saying this is going to be difficult because you can't fool a fooler, you can't kid a kidder. He knows all the tricks, he knows the actual data behind the stats, and if he decides to go after us, he'll know what it is that we do. Do we expect to see more of this from Wheeler? Are you surprised that he said this?
No, I'm not surprised at all. You know, the DSL industry has been a lot of smoke and mirrors for a very, very long time. And it's all a product of our aging copper infrastructure. All we have to do is look at NTT in Tokyo, where they keep laughing at the United States on how slow our broadband is. Heck, you can get a 768K triple BRI ISDN link on a freaking payphone in Tokyo. Not so much in America.
No, not at all. Curtis, let me get you into this discussion, because it would be easy to make a Captain Obvious remark here that, this is what we've all been saying. The people who've been paying attention to net neutrality have been saying, look, there is no competition. There's no way for me to jump from one vendor to another because DSL just doesn't compare against cable. Is this the real Wheeler? Is this the Wheeler that we are going to see? He got off on the wrong foot by backing a plan that most of us thought was an absolute violation of net neutrality principles. But is this the FCC chairman that we're supposed to have, or is this just a respite from, again, cable toady man?
Well, I'll admit that I'm torn, because on the one hand, it would be nice to be able to think that he heard the citizens when they responded to his first proposal, and that he learned from that. And what we're hearing now is the new, perhaps somewhat evolved Wheeler. On the other hand, it's impossible to get away from the fact that he is in a very political position, and we are a couple of months in front of midterm elections. So am I confident that this is the real Wheeler? No. I would say that I am perhaps cautiously optimistic, but I'm going to have to see a lot more actions to back up these nice words before I believe that we've really turned a corner with the chairman.
Cheever, this wasn't just a jab at the cable industry, not just at Comcast and Time Warner, although he didn't name them specifically. It's also a jab at the traditional telcos, AT&T and Verizon. He's telling them, look, your DSL isn't broadband, which then again brings back up the Cable Communications Act of 1984 and the Communications Act of 1996 and the big buyout that the telcos got to build the next generation broadband network, where they promised 44 megabits per second and they delivered somewhere under 1. Is this a turning point? Is this to say, look, this can't be the status quo. Cable companies, you're not competing enough, and telcos, you're not fast enough?
Well, I'm hoping and praying that this is going to be a turning point, because the reality is there's an awful lot of small businesses run out of homes, and having more bandwidth in the home or residence or even small businesses makes a pretty big difference in what they can deliver. I could easily see that if we had, say, even 100 meg per second, even 40 meg per second at every household, we could start seeing some really interesting things. And it's really going to start plugging into some of the plans that the guys at AT&T and a lot of the big players and the National Science Foundation have on the next generation internet, which, spoilers, we're going to talk about a little later.
Maybe. I'm not going to promise anything. Curtis, let me ask you this. Assuming that this isn't all just bluster, and actually Geoff in the chat room said, wait a minute, Wheeler denigrating DSL is of benefit to the cable industry, so maybe this is just a red herring. But let's put all that aside for a second. Let's say that this is an earnest, honest call for dialogue to say, look, what can we do to provide broadband, real broadband to the United States? What can they do? Well, honestly, what powers does the FCC have to encourage competition? What powers does the FCC have to try to make AT&T and Verizon and some smaller ISPs actually deliver on the promise of a next-generation network?
They don't really have an awful lot of tools at their disposal. I think that the big things they can do involve some redefinition of broadband, so that they can regulate it. As we know, right now it is not defined in a way that legally gives them the power to regulate it, as we've seen with all of the net neutrality issues. The other thing that they can do is go through and forgive me, I'm running on about 2 hours of sleep last night, but I know that there's the program by which broadband access is provided to schools around the country.
Right. That's Title. What title is it? Title 11 or Title 10?
Oh, can't remember.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been in there. But yeah, it was the cheap broadband initiative for schools.
Right, and that's a huge dollar program around the country. The FCC has a role in how that is administered, how those contracts are awarded. And I suspect that they could use those contracts as a great whopping carrot and stick combo to urge the telcos to move in a particular direction. But barring some sort of major legislative action, and right now I don't think any sane person is anticipating even minor legislative action, they're really limited. You know, what they can offer is the power of the bully pulpit, some minor legislative or regulatory tweaks, and hoping for the best.
Now, Curtis, Comcast didn't take this sitting down. I mean, again, Wheeler didn't specifically call them out, but they seemed compelled to answer the challenge. Within hours, they came out and basically said, no, that's not right.
That's right. And, you know, they hauled out some of their sort of classic arguments about this, including this will be good for the industry. This will allow us to deploy infrastructure more rapidly. This will give consumers more choice. This will allow us to offer better services. And the executive vice president of Comcast, a gentleman named David Cohen, made a breathtakingly ironic argument when he said, quote, "The Comcast-Time Warner merger won't affect competition because they don't compete against each other in any market," end quote. Now, the fascinating thing is that that's exactly the kind of point that Wheeler was making. When Cohen made the argument that, quote, "the increased scale created by this transaction will accelerate and encourage even more investment in R&D, innovation, and infrastructure," that's really the best part, because if the two largest cable ISPs aren't competing in the same markets, of course we can count on new, small, innovative startups to rise up against a gigantic cable presence. Not. Yeah. You know, Padre, now I'm curious, you've heard these arguments. You know, what's your take? Do you think that Cohen somehow made a compelling argument in all this?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, these are the same arguments we've heard from the NCTA, the National Cable Telecommunications Association, for the past 20 years. They've always been saying, look, let us get bigger. Trust us. We're going to make it really, really good. And that's not necessarily how it's turned out. Now, to be fair, cable speeds have increased. Prices haven't kept pace with the rest of the world, nor has the technology deployment to all parts of the country. Now, the big thing that bothers me here is, and I think you picked up on this, when he said that the Comcast-Time Warner merger won't affect competition because they already don't compete in the same markets. That's absolutely true. And Chee, I want to bring you in on this, because this is one of those things that when insiders start taking a look at how cable services work in the United States, they wonder, why is it that Comcast and Time Warner don't exist in any of the same markets? They compete head-to-head. They go after the same customers, but it's almost as if they've reached a detente saying, well, you don't bother our customer base, and we won't bother your customer base. And that's illegal, right? You can't do that.
Well, it's not so much that it's illegal, it's that it's a lot of it has to do with how the public utility commissions work across the United States. You have to determine who owns the freaking poles. Poles, real estate is a very, very expensive piece of real estate, and he who built the poles owns the poles. It's a rare municipality that owns their own poles. And in those cases, you start seeing some really interesting competition. Here in Hawaii, there's an area where the developer actually put in extra conduit for as yet unnamed technology. unfortunately, they have charged such high rates on using those conduit spaces that it's basically created a single monopoly yet again. So I think it's all about, it isn't so much about the competition as so much about how to get that last mile in. And I think it's going to take some really, really interesting finagling by the Public Utilities Commissions throughout the United States to actually break this logjam.
I like that. And actually, I think we've got a case in point, right? I remember reading a story about CenturyLink, specifically their deployment into Nevada, into Las Vegas. They were trying to roll out trials of the GFAST technology that we talked about on Twiat not too long ago. It's the technology that would allow them to push out gigabit over existing copper. But they've run into issues, right, Cheebert?
Oh, yeah. There's, you run into this niggling problem of the laws of physics. If you're running on old copper that has a lot of screw connectors and a lot of splices and a lot of this and that and changing impedances in the cable, you don't get very far. A really good example is what happened on the island of Kauai in Hawaii when Hurricane Iniki came through and trashed nearly 100% of the poles on the entire island. What Kauai got was a forklift upgrade of their infrastructure. And as a result, DSL speeds on the island of Kauai are significantly better than the rest of the state.
Right, right. And, going back to the CenturyLink example, Comcast was using this argument that, well, they can't be allowed into the territories that they serve because they don't serve every house. Now, going back from your Iniki example, when they're trying to deploy in a place like Nevada, where some of the infrastructure is incredibly old and therefore cannot be used with their new GFAST, Comcast is saying because you're not serving the entire city or the entire population, you can't serve any of the population. It sounds like a stupid argument, but Comcast has successfully used that during CenturyLink's rollout in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So let me throw this over to you, Curtis. It seems as if Comcast knows all the right buttons to push when they want to slow down slow down the installation of a competitor, and it may have something to do with the fact that they help write the regulations that govern their industry.
Yeah, I think, a lot of us are accusing these companies of being predators. No one is really accusing them of being stupid. They know how to use the regulations, as you point out. They generally wrote them. And the relationship between these entities, these companies, and the regulatory bodies that may exist is very, very cozy. You see a lot of people moving back and forth between them, especially at the staff levels throughout their careers. It's an interesting problem because the trade-off for allowing a utility to be a regulated monopoly was that they would essentially eat the cost of serving those customers in remote and therefore very expensive locations. What we're seeing now in deregulation is companies and regulators trying to draw that line. If you say we're going to deregulate, what it means is that a handful of easy to serve, affluent customers are going to get superb service, while the less affluent and generally more remote customers will get non-existent service. I mean, they're back to kite string and oatmeal boxes. The trying to figure out how to keep what is becoming known as a basic utility right going to everyone while introducing competition is a tricky issue. And I think it's fair to say that so far we've seen a lot of people show us how to get it wrong.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on to something connected, just in case you weren't having issues with the ISPs just enough. Right now, there are 20 states, at least 20 states in the United States that have laws or regulatory guidelines that make either illegal or extremely difficult the creation of any municipal broadband system, the delivery of fiber-based services to residents. Basically, it's a non-compete clause that the local government has signed with Time Warner or AT&T, Verizon, or Comcast. Now, case in point would be Washington, D.C. This is the case I use because I used to live in D.C. and I ran into this issue all the time. Back in the 90s, DC tried to provide a municipal broadband system. The idea was, since it was a small area, it would be simple enough to test a next-generation 100 gigabit per second fiber ring around the city that could be delivered to all of the residents of the city. Now, in 1999, Comcast threatened to turn off all of their services, cable TV and their cable internet, if DC continued to push with that. In response, the city caved and gave Comcast a non-compete clause, which meant that the city was allowed by Comcast to build their fiber ring, their 100 gigabit per second network, but that the network could only be used by certain nonprofits and certain government agencies. What that means is that there's actually a next-generation super fast network sitting inside of DC. All the fiber is run, all the connections are made, but the people who paid for it can't actually use it. That's just one example of what we see with these non-compete clauses throughout these 20 states. Chee, let me get you in on this, because you've actually experienced a little bit of this in Hawaii. Yes, we need to give the incumbent some sort of benefit for getting in there first and for doing the capital outlay. But where is that balance point between protecting their investment and encouraging new investment and encouraging new competition?
Well, actually, in Hawaii, I was part of the Coalition for Competitive Telecommunication, and this political action group actually broke the Hawaiian telephone monopoly a year before the feds did. But that was on telco. Now, one of the things that did happen and has been anti-competition is because of the way the incumbent has lobbied, Hawaiian Electric runs fiber optics on all their high voltage lines because you can. And they actually attempted to lease dark fiber to places like Bank of Hawaii and First Hawaiian and people like that. The Public Utilities Commission got slammed by the telco and said, no, that's a regulated thing and you can't do that. And unfortunately, the incumbent won. So Hawaiian Electric actually has a boatload of fiber optics hanging above our heads that can only be used to link their power stations.
Wonderful. Curtis, let me give you the cherry on top, because I think this goes back to the question I asked you about what could the FCC do. To further the story about Washington, D.C., and by the way, the same story played out, I believe, in Seattle, Washington, and Peoria, Illinois. There were several cities that had the exact same thing happen whenever a municipal broadband system tried to roll out. In D.C., Verizon made a pact with Comcast to stop expanding their Fios system. In other words, they'd continue serving the customers they already had, but they wouldn't push it any further. They wouldn't allow for new deployments if Comcast would allow Verizon to use some of the spectrum that Comcast had acquired, because Verizon was trying to roll out a new wireless service. What that meant was that in the city of D.C., if you look on paper, there's actually three providers. There's AT&T, there's Verizon, and there's Comcast, but they don't overlap. There's very few parts of the city where you can get two of those. You can only get AT&T, Verizon, or Comcast. This seems to be like something that maybe the FCC could have power over, right?
Well, now you start getting into the difference between a federally regulated utility and local regulations. And I think this is one of those cases where the issues really are around the local regulatory body, in this case, the City Commission. Now, in D.C., that may well be the FCC, which has, as we know, D.C. is a strange situation. But in most cities, you're talking about the City Commission or whatever the equivalent is, having the regulatory authority within that city. And what you often have there is a group of local politicians who are suddenly faced with arguments made by a company with deeper pockets than they've ever encountered before. And I have done some work in testing and other things with telcos, and it is sheerly astounding how much cash they throw off and what they're willing to spend. Most local regulatory bodies simply don't have the wherewithal to effectively make arguments against them. The one time when citizens can play a role if you look at the contracts that allow these companies to be monopolies within a municipality, they have finite lifespans. So every 5, 10, 15 years, whatever the duration is, that contract comes up for renewal. And at that point, the citizens can demand that the contract be changed, that the incumbent can be thrown out, that all the rules can be changed. They'll be fighting against money, but if the citizens want it, that's the time, and really the only time, when change can be made without costing the city an awful lot of money. Because as with any contract, the contracts that protect incumbents can in fact be changed. There's usually just a clause in there that makes it a truly expensive proposition to do so.
Well, there you have it, folks. Change comes from within, or from Google installing fiber in your city. Now, when we come back, we're going to be bringing in Steve Gibson from grc.com. He's our security guru here at Twit TV, and he wants to tell us all about cloud storage. But before that, let's take a moment to talk about our second sponsor, the wonderful sponsor of the Twilight Riot, IT Pro TV. Now, maybe you want to get into IT. A lot of our listeners want to. A lot of our viewers think, hey, maybe that's the career for me. But the learning curve has a lot of people intimidated. But don't feel bad. There are thousands and thousands of people like you who want to get into the field, but they just don't know where to start. Certs are good to show what you know, and some sort of apprenticeship is good to be able to practice what you know. But what you really need is a comprehensive source of IT knowledge that can both teach you and be your companion as you grow. Well, we now have that answer. It's called IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is a video network dedicated exclusively to the world of information technology. They offer hundreds of hours of content, with 30 hours being added each week. They have an extensive and growing episode library with video courses on Apple, Microsoft, Cisco, and more, with course topics that cover practical subjects like network security, Linux, Windows, and OS X support for desktops and servers, and dozens of other real-world situations. My favorite part of their training is their virtual machine sandbox. It's a lab environment for hands-on practice and learning that lets you play with millions of dollars worth of gear from the comfort of your own HTML-compatible browser. Now, the episode library is organized by exam objectives, making it easy for you to target your trouble areas, better preparing you to pass your certification test. They also have an intuitive interface and a learning management system that allows you to track your progress in each lesson. So you can figure out if you've got any holes, any weak spots, anything that needs to be practiced. Because of this lesson targeting, even if you're already studying with a book or enrolled in a certification program, IT Pro TV is a perfect way to supplement your learning at your own pace. Shows are streamed live and are available on demand worldwide to your Roku, computer, or mobile device. You pay one low monthly price comparable to a cert manual, which gives you all-access membership with daily updates. They have a no-hassle, no-muss, no-fuss, easy cancellation policy, and they've even included measure-up practice exams, which is a $79 value. And annual subscribers can download episodes and audio-only MP3s for offline consumption. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to check out itpro.tv/enterprise and upgrade your brain with the most popular certifications recognized by employers. There's also a free preview on the site if you want to check out some of their videos or their live stream. Subscriptions are normally $57 per month or $570 for the entire year, but we have a special offer because they're huge fans of Twit. If you sign up now and use the code ENTERPRISE30, you'll receive 30% off your subscription for the lifetime of your account. That's less than $40 per month or $3.99 for the entire year. That's itpro.tv/enterprise and use the code ENTERPRISE30 to receive 30% off. And we thank IT Pro TV for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. We welcome onto the show a man who I have great respect for, Mr. Steve Gibson from grc.com. Steve, thank you for agreeing to be on Twilight.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Padre. Great to be on with you, Brian and Curtis.
Now this last week has been interesting times. There was a breach. We all know about the breach. We've all heard about the breach in cloud security. Nothing tremendously new as far as the technology is concerned, but I think it's a really good jumping off spot. It's a learning moment for us to reach out to the masses, those people who are in the know about enterprise tech, those are the people who are in the know about security, and say, do you understand what you're doing when you put something in the cloud? Now, I was going to do it, but maybe you could give us a rundown of what exactly happened in the Apple hack, even though they're saying it's not a hack.
Well, okay, so the notorious problem with cybercrime is that unlike physical crime, where you almost inadvertently leave behind some sort of evidence, even if you were wearing gloves and you wiped your physical fingerprints off of something, you know, there's often a camera that's aimed at you that caught you in the act, or someone driving by might have seen you. The point is, in the physical world, it is extremely difficult not to leave any details of the physical act of the crime. It's certainly the case that cyber systems have logs and maintain a trail of evidence, but because it's not in the physical world, people who are good at these sorts of things have very effective ways of erasing their own footprints from, you know, their cyber footprints from behind the things they do. So here we have a situation where, you know, as you said, this really wasn't anything that we haven't seen often before. However, unlike many of these breaches where it's, you know, we're told that there's a collection of digital data that was stolen, in this case, these were naked photographs of celebrities. And so suddenly everyone's very interested. It's like, wait a minute. Okay, where are the naked photographs of the celebrities? No one cares if it's credit card numbers, but if you've got naked photographs, oh, now it's suddenly much more interesting. So as a consequence, mostly of what was stolen, suddenly this is on everyone's radar. I mean, you know, last week you couldn't turn on news in any venue without having this story reported, whereas most of the time we're talking about these cyber breaches within a much smaller audience of people who care about the underlying problem and the technology, and we talk about solutions. Suddenly now it goes mainstream because it's naked photographs. So the problem is that I would argue we still don't have as clear a picture as we would like of how this crime was perpetrated. You know, the low-level details. Apple certainly had a big a security problem that they should have locked down months ago. They were informed, I believe it was back in May, that their Find My iPhone cloud service had a clear vulnerability in the fact that there was no lockout from brute force guessing. So it may, and again, we have to say may because unfortunately we still don't know for sure exactly how this happened. It may have been that after that became common knowledge, then details of various celebrities' lives were used to aid in the brute force hacking of their iCloud accounts that allowed some of their data, including photos that they had uploaded or that they didn't even upload, but that their iServices that Apple was making available backed up to the iCloud in order to like automatically protect them from data loss in the event that their device was stolen or crashed and died. Somehow this stuff was exfiltrated from their own little iWorld and got out into the hands of hackers who then posted it online with great fanfare.
Right. Curtis and Brian, I want to bring you into the discussion here. And this is where when I talk about that teaching moment, what Steve has discussed is a lot of the circumstances behind this hack. And again, I'm reluctant to call it a hack, but we'll call it a hack for the sake of the program.
Breach.
A breach.
Thank you.
Breach.
Yes.
This breach. First, It was a crime. So 'cause we are going to get backlash from people who said, don't you understand that these people were victims? Yes, this is a crime. The people whose data was stolen were absolutely victims of that crime. The criminals who took that data are criminals, no matter how they did it, no matter how they accomplished the breach. We are not discussing any of the ethics or the legality, and we're not trying to assess blame. But what I want to bring out is this idea, and actually someone in the chat room pointed this out. There are so many people who don't understand what it means when they put something up in the cloud. This idea of the cloud really only surfaced within the last 6 years or so. And I think it would be kind of a shock to some people if you said, by the way, every time you say in the cloud, replace that with on a random hard drive somewhere with thousands of other people's data.
Or somebody else's computer.
Or someone else's computer, right.
This is on somebody else's computer. Calling it the cloud sort of sanitizes it and makes it seem, you know, like ephemeral and like, oh, no one can get to it. It's nothing other than somebody else's computer.
Right. And Chee, we've run into this before, right? I mean, when I remember at Interop, when the cloud started to be like the term to use, there was always sort of a bristling of, you understand, it's just a data center. It's nothing different than what you've used before. You're just giving it a silly name.
Well, you also need to keep in mind that, you know, when you say the cloud, you're also talking about a layer of abstraction. So it actually removes the direct manipulation. So when someone else is managing it, that also leaves some human error possibilities of, oops, I didn't secure that particular hole.
Right. And Curtis, I want to bring you in here on this. I can't remember if you were in the room when we had this discussion, but again, it was at Interop. And there was some sort of chit-chat going on between a potential customer and some PR person talking about how we're taking all your data and putting it in the cloud and in the cloud and in the cloud. Must have mentioned the cloud 30 times in 5 minutes. And then the engineer who was hanging out with the potential client said, you understand that they're a competitor. So this is the same thing as saying you want us to put the data that we previously had on our private servers on our campus into a server that's controlled by a competitor. Again, that's one of those things that in the enterprise, there's been a very slow movement to the cloud because it's used to maintaining physical security over all sensitive data.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And there's still a lot of questioning about the security, you know, and what we have seen with many enterprises is that it is in fact possible to use a service that is defined either by technicians or by marketers as a cloud service in a secure way. You know, what we're seeing going on here is I would make the analogy to a bank. We know that banks are generally safe places to keep our money, safer generally than, say, stuffed into our mattress. But when we do that, we want to go to the teller and go through the whole process of putting our money in through secure processes and making sure that the transaction has been completed before we walk away. What we're seeing in a lot of these vulnerability and intrusion cases is the equivalent of someone walking into a bank lobby, stuffing or putting a pile of cash down on a counter and walking back out the door. The level of security is just about the same.
Right. Reverb Mike in the chat room is saying, look, the cloud is, dude, all your data is on some other dude's computer in a basement. I want to get back over to you, Steve. One of the things that we wanted to talk about in this whole cloud storage special is something that's been happening recently. I mean, when we talked about Dropbox, when we talked about OneDrive and all its predecessors and all its competitors, the whole idea was you had to make the choice to upload data into a private cloud or into a public cloud. With a lot of services today on mobile devices, on your iPad, your Android tablet, that decision can actually be made for you. It gets automatically uploaded, and a lot of people don't actually understand that's what's happening. That's what caused this breach, right? I mean, there were sensitive data that got uploaded to someone's iCloud account because it automatically does that from their iPhone, and they didn't realize that this data has now left my person.
Right. I guess the way to think about it is that either the individual controls the completely and from a cryptographic standpoint controls their data, or they have allowed someone else to do that. If you allow someone else to do that, you are utterly relying on that other entity to always do the right thing. Not most of the time, but absolutely perfectly. And that means all of that entity's employees, for example, and any agreement that entity might have with other organizations, because we also see, you know, sometimes they're farming services out or they're using subcontractors and so forth. So either the individual maintains control and assumes responsibility at the cryptographic level, so that the only thing they're asking is to store this encrypted data, or they allow someone else to. An example is Apple's iMessage system. Apple, for example, says all of your iMessages are encrypted, so we're unable to access it. No one else can access it. Don't worry. The problem is the users don't manage the keys for encryption. Apple manages that for them. So while it's true that the data is encrypted, if the user's not managing their own cryptographic keys, if they've subcontracted that out, if they've farmed it out in any way, even to Apple, then you are relying upon Apple to always manage your keys the way you would want them to. And that's not actually something that the user can enforce. So the problem is, imposing the burden of cryptographic management on every single user. It's certainly something that enthusiasts can do if they choose to, but it really does create a burden for the user, which most users just don't care about. Unfortunately, the people whose naked pictures are now loose didn't care about that.
Right, right. And actually, I think that's absolutely the crux of the issue, which is people just want it to work. How many times have we heard that? And so they're not going to pay attention to, is it being properly encrypted? Do I have the encryption keys? Am I going to make sure that I don't get sync poisoning? There are so many issues that are involved whenever we talk about backing up our data to a server that we do not have control over. And actually, I want to talk a little bit about that. Before we take a break, since we are an enterprise show, let's talk a little bit about an enterprise issue that we run into whenever we talk about the cloud. This is something that we brought up on Twiat quite a bit. Actually, the first time was in episode 26, way back when. Chee and Curtis, do you remember the story about Mega Upload? And,
of course.
Yeah, the issue of extraterritoriality, whether you can or cannot seize data off of a server that is not within the jurisdictional boundaries of your country. And the United States Department of Justice made the claim, which they have not rescinded, by the way, that they weren't actually seizing data. Therefore, they weren't obligated to follow the rules of seizure, because even though there were thousands of users on any particular server, they were only seizing the hardware. And it was immaterial whether or not there were thousands of different people's data on the hardware that they were seizing. The case revolved around Mr. Kyle Goodwin, who, along with the EFF, sued the United States federal government, saying, you weren't after my data. There was no infringing information on my data, so can I have it back? It's important to me. And the United States federal government said, well, we'll make it available for you, but we have no obligation because, in their words, if mere use of a service was sufficient to create legal ownership interest in servers leased by Mega Upload from Carpathia, then there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of owners of each and every single Carpathia server, and that is obviously absurd. But Chee, Curtis, that's exactly what happens on a server that's acting as a cloud storage node, yes?
Oh, yeah. Except we're talking even more, millions of people when you start talking about a cloud service. One thing I do want to point out is a lot of this is user education. Let's use the example of credit cards, since we've talked about the Target and the P.F. Chang breach. Users in America aren't used to doing multi-factor authentication. And the expectation is that, oh, password's just fine. But when you have chip and pin, it's not only what you have, but it's also what you know. And the Europeans, the rest of the world, in fact, are used to multi-factor authentication, and America isn't. So I think that's one of the things that also needs to be brought up, that not only do we have a lot of people's, a lot of data, and yeah, the United States government has to start thinking about that, but there's a lot of education components that are missing from a lot of conversations, that multi-factor authentication needs to happen.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Curtis, let me bring you in on this. We just had a case about Ireland doing the exact same thing, right? The Microsoft is defending against the Department of Justice, who said just because you store data in another country doesn't mean that we don't have legal jurisdiction over that data. What I'm trying to bring up is storing it in the cloud becomes less and less of an option for enterprise when you think that you are now far more vulnerable to having your data seized by different entities.
Well, and in the same way that we were talking about multi-factor authentication, I think we have to talk about any responsible enterprise that uses a cloud service, especially for storage, having multi-level backups. It's one thing to have data in a cloud service. It's another thing entirely if your only copy of that data is in a cloud service. I know, for example, with some of my critical files, I have them in 3 separate physical locations, including at least one cloud service, but others that are local and under my control. If you're going to be a responsible enterprise user, you have to go through that same process. We have seen our government, and in fairness, there have been some others, say, look, we will do whatever we must to get at those we consider criminals. And if it happens to destroy you and your business, well, that's just collateral damage.
Sorry about that.
Knowing that this is the environment in which not just the cloud, but network and hosted service providers and other things operate, it simply becomes part of good business IT practice to have multiple backup copies of all critical data, certainly, but all data in multiple locations.
Gentlemen, when we come back, I want to do the brawl for it all. Let's talk about mitigating these issues, both for the consumer and for the enterprise. What can you do if you want to protect data that you are going to put into the cloud? But before we get to that, let's take a break to talk about the third sponsor of the Twiat Riot, and it's TechServe. Now, we know that Apple is big. Apple is everywhere, and we probably don't spend enough time on this program talking about the different ways that enterprises, retail businesses, and the like have integrated Apple products into their business strategy, which is why it's great that we've got TechServe to explain it for us. Businesses keep coming up with creative ways to service their customers, to increase productivity among employees, and to make more money with the same resources. That's what it's all about. Can you get more of a value add by using the iPad? For example, the Institute of Culinary Education equips students, faculty, and chefs with the iPad, empowering them to do away with heavy and unwieldy textbooks and streamlining the learning process. A major cable service provider in the Northeast gave its field technicians, who are the public face of the company, iPads that had been configured to provide better service to customers. And retail companies have enhanced their in-store customer experience by using the iPad, not just as a point-of-sale terminal, but also as a spot where customers can learn about sales, special offers, and upcoming events. All of those clients and more have turned to TechServe, the country's largest Apple reseller that sells, supports, and manages the largest iPad deployments in the world to manage their iPad projects. If you're considering adding iPads to your business, why not ensure your project's success with an experienced partner? TechServe assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple solutions, as well as solutions from Avid, Adobe, and more within the United States. No matter if you've started deploying iPads already or are just getting started, TechServe can help. Right now, TechServe is offering a complimentary download just for Twiat listeners who are deploying iPads or who are interested in learning more about doing so. Go to techserve.com/Twiat-7sins to get access to the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment and see the common pitfalls that throw companies for a loop during their iPad projects. This complimentary download is available right now just for my listeners at tekserve.com/Twiat. twiet-7sins. And we thank TechServe for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's get back to the meat with the rest of the show. Let's start talking about where we go from here. We had this really cool story about replacing TCP/IP with NDN, which was named data networking, but I think I want to bypass that and instead have a little chit-chat with Steve Gibson. Steve, right now, Leo Laporte is in our chat room, and he's really passionate about this. He's talking about what two-factor authentication can and cannot do, what encryption can and cannot do. So I put this question to you. As a consumer, first, we'll talk about enterprise later. As a consumer looking to put my data in the cloud, do I just have to assume that I have no privacy, I have no way to keep breaches from happening, or is there something that I can do to protect my data?
Okay, so this sort of segues right from what I was saying before. The issue is, if you're not going to take responsibility yourself, then you are giving it to another organization, and then you're relying upon them. So the first issue is, do users are users truly concerned enough about managing this data themselves to take responsibility for it? To make that practical, we need, in today's world, we need multi-platform solutions. 10 years ago, that was a problem. Today, it really isn't, because anyone who is offering these solutions understands the need that they have to be able to be compatible with Windows and Macintosh and Android and iOS, maybe BlackBerry, and some solutions are. So, you know, the multi-platform need has been solved. The reason I say this multi-platform issue is important is that users still want to be able to do whatever they want to do with their data on different platforms. But if you're going to be encrypting your data and being able to access it on your iPhone, on your Android device, on Windows, on Mac, then you need to be able to encrypt and decrypt on those different devices. If you're not responsible for the encryption, then all of your devices somehow arrange to see the data unencrypted, so the platform problem has been solved elsewhere. But if you're taking responsibility, then you need to make sure if the data is encrypted, you're able to access it, and that means decrypt it, no matter what platform you're on.
Got it. Got it. Cheebert, so what he's talking about, he's talking about taking control of your own data, making sure that you have your keys, and understanding that the level of security is going to be directly, inversely proportional to the ease in which you use it. My question to you is this. Again, we're not blaming the victims here. We're not saying, oh, it's your fault. Why did you put that on the web? Why did you put that in the cloud? Why did you take those pictures, et cetera, et cetera? I think what we're trying to say, and this is back to that learning moment, is if you are going to use the cloud, you have to understand how it works. I think that's what Steve is trying to say. That's what he's trying to get at, that people have to have at least a modicum of understanding as to the technologies that's going to be storing their sensitive data. But Cheebert, you work at a campus. You work at a place with incredibly sensitive data. Do you have a policy? Does the university have a policy on where things can and cannot be stored?
Well, academics in general have policies that, you know, research projects funded by U.S. federal government agencies have to be stored within the United States. Anything that goes offshore is a problem. Now, one of the things that a lot of people are starting to talk about is, you know, well, one, the University of Hawaii says, thou shalt not have unencrypted logins, period. In fact, they will actually go, and if you have, say, a telnet server where it's unencrypted logins or an FTP server where unencrypted logins, the IT group will go and pound on the sysadmin saying, hey, no, that's against acceptable use policies. My personal opinion is I don't I don't disagree with Leo. Leo likes end-to-end encryption, and I like end-to-end encryption also. The problem is when you have a single key or you have someone else trusting the keys for you, you lose that control. And I kind of like that. I like the whole chip and pin concept where it's something you have and something you know. That way, if someone, say if your kids borrow a credit card, if they don't have the pin, they can't use it. Right now in the United States, anyone can use it. So personally, I think it'd be really nice to have, end-to-end encryption. And I like the concept of the next generation networks, when we start talking about NDN, where encryption is actually built in. When the internet first came to be, it was all about making sure you could talk to each other. Now, I'm sorry, the world has changed, and end-to-end encryption is something that we need to have designed in. Users are not going to want to learn how encryption works. They just want it to work. They want an appliance. And until we make it easier for them to manage their own encryption keys, it's not going to happen. You see it in science fiction. You've got to go and put a thumbprint on this or something. I think we need to go in that direction. I'm just not sure how we're going to get there yet.
Right. Curtis, let me give you one real quick question. Back when we first started covering the enterprise use of cloud storage, I believe that was episode 26 of Twiat, all three of us were in agreement that you could use cloud, but you would never, ever use it for anything that was sensitive. And since then, there have been so many stories that have convinced us that, yeah, no, you don't want to use it because it's easily breached. You don't want to use it because it's subject to extraterritorial jurisdiction. You don't want to use it because you lose control of that sensitive data. And yet, we've seen more and more enterprises push sensitive data into the cloud. That's why a few episodes ago, we had a specific a vendor that specifically caters cloud solutions to the enterprise, where it's not as open as something like a Dropbox. My question to you is this something we're going to see in the enterprise? I mean, is this inevitable? Is the price point of cloud storage so low and the convenience so high that we're just going to have to live with the fact that sometimes absolutely vital information is going to be in a format, in a media, and in a location that is not ideal?
Short answer is yes. And most enterprise security officers recognize that. They recognize that not only is the cloud infrastructure porous, but their own perimeter is porous as well. And so that's why when I talk to people who are doing this, the notion of end-to-end encryption is critical. The assumption is there that someone, somewhere, is going to get your data. That's just a fact of life. So your job is twofold. One, to have systems set up so that you recognize when an intrusion has taken place and mitigate it as quickly as possible. And two, that all of your data is stored in a form that makes it unusable to anyone who is accessing it from an unauthorized location or with an unauthorized login. As Brian said, the key is making this essentially invisible to the user. We see time after time that users are either unwilling or unable to take even one additional step to secure their hardware and the data that they touch. It has to be something that is programmatic and automatic if it's going to secure enterprise data.
Steve, I'm going to ask a very different kind of request of you. Leo Laporte is in our chat room right now, and he is passionate about end-to-end encryption, trust no one security, keeping your keys. Can you channel him for just a bit? Because I know that philosophy comes out of all his conversations with you in Security Now, which, by the way, if you don't watch it, that is the best security-based podcast in the universe. You go check it out, twit.tv/SN. Is that it? Is that all we can hope for? End-to-end encryption plus keeping your own keys. So we don't use a service that doesn't allow us to have end-to-end. We don't use a service that doesn't allow us to keep our own keys. Is there anything else? Like, for example, I'm thinking there should be a component of data hygiene, knowing how cloud works, even if it's end-to-end encrypted, even if you have your own keys, knowing what can and cannot go into the cloud?
Okay, so, you know, we began talking about multi-factor authentication years ago on Security Now. And so I found it sort of interesting that, you know, as a consequence of last week's breach, I'm hearing people talk about it, not only on the Twit network, of course, but, you know, in the popular press. It's not a new idea. It is, I think one of the things we see is that change occurs with glacial slowness. The problem is that usernames and passwords are so well established now that we are seeing change, but it's happening very slowly. And listening to some of the podcasts on this network over the last week, I've heard people talk about, for example, what a poor implementation Apple has of multi-factor authentication, that it isn't good. And so I think it's certainly the case that this can be made easier. I certainly agree with Brian and Curtis that this has to be as transparent as possible. One way or another, users are going to have to be disabused of the belief that a username and password is enough. But the only reason users now are only using username and password is that's all they've had to use. I mean, that's all we as an industry asked them to do is username and password. And originally, they could use bad passwords. You know, the whole concept of the quality of a password, the concept of not using the same password everywhere. These are new ideas relative to logging in. So users will do what we ask them to do, but we're only asking more very recently and only very reluctantly. So it's up to us, the industry, to lead, and users will do pretty much what we tell them to.
Gentlemen, I want to continue. I want to go on, but unfortunately we have gone over our time, and I'm now having angry producers wave things at me. So I think that means we're going to have to call this episode. Steve Gibson from from SteveGibsonResearch.com. Please go there. You're going to find the wonderful program that I use often, Shields Up. You're also going to find SpinRite if you're ever having an issue with not just hard disk drives, but with SSDs as well. You need SpinRite in your toolkit. I want to thank you for being on here, and I'm sure you're going to continue this discussion tomorrow on Security Now. You can find that at twit.tv, live.twit.tv at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. If you could please tell our audience where they can find you, where they can find your products, and where they can find your musings about security.
grc.com, GibsonResearchCorporation.com.
Fantastic. We thank you for coming on to Twit. It is always a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely my pleasure, Padre.
We also thank our regular host, gentlemen who are, well, security gurus in their own right, Mr. Brian Chee. Thank you again for joining us for another wonderful edition of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Can you tell the folks where they can find you and the projects that you've been working on?
Right now, I'm actually hiding because I've got a workload that would choke a horse. But I am currently learning how to do a new type of layer 2 protocol called Precision Time Protocol. And it was developed by CERN Laboratories for synchronizing their ring. And it gives you a clock of less than 1 nanosecond precision. And we are thinking real strongly about using that to be able to measure the shift in the continental shelf.
Fantastic. Curtis Franklin, hopefully you don't have a workload that will also choke a horse. What are you doing, and where can the Twit Riot find you in your off time?
Lots and lots of radio goodness going on. And the thing that I want to tell everybody about this week happens on Friday of this week. EE Times is doing a radio show talking all about the goodness of open source processors. Love to have some of the Twiat Riot over there. That's going to happen at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday at eetimes.com. Come on over and lend your voice to what's sure to be a great discussion.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being part of this show, for being part of episode 106 of the best dang enterprise podcast in the universe. That's according to 9 out of 10 cloud storage vendors. I also want to thank you. That's right, the folks at home who download our show, who watch us live. If it weren't for you talking about our episodes, spreading them with friends, telling your colleagues and your family that this is where you need to go if you want to find out about what's going on in the enterprise, well, we wouldn't have a show. So we want to do something just for you. Right now, if you go to our show page at twit.tv/Twiat, you're going to find a little drop-down menu that gives you the feeds. That's right, you can have each and every single episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech automatically downloaded to the device of choice with the format of choice. If you want it in your iPad for the drive to work, an audio version maybe, then yeah, you could do that. If you want it in a standard definition video file for your iPad so you can watch on your break, you can do that. If you want it to download to your Mac or your PC so that you could play it off of your TV at home, well, you can do that. It's part of the things that we do because we love you. Also, did you know that you can find me on Twitter? That's right. If you go to twitter.com/Twiat, you're going to be able to find not just me, but also all of the projects that I'm involved in. It's a nice way to keep in touch with me between shows. I do quite a few here on the Twit TV network. You'll find me Mondays for Twiat at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. On Tuesdays, you'll find me for Padres Corner. In fact, tomorrow, I'm probably going to be doing a little bit of ranting about the cable industry at 7:30 p.m. On Thursdays, you're going to find me twice, once at 11 o'clock for Know How, which is a maker show with Brian Burnett, and 1:30 p.m. Pacific time for Coding 101 with Snubs, Shannon Morse, for a little bit of coding. Finally, I want to thank everyone here at the Brick House who makes this show possible, to Carson, my super producer, to Leo and Lisa, who let me bother them every once in a while, and of course, to my TD extraordinaire, Mr. Jason Howell. Jason, again, this is normally the time where I pretend like I don't know what you do here at the Twit studio, which would be strange, considering the fact that I've been working with you for 2 years. But I understand that you do some Android-y stuff.
Yep, a couple of them, in fact. All About Android is Tuesdays. That's twit.tv/AAA. And then Android App Arena is Fridays. That's twit.tv/Arena. Apps in both shows, but tomorrow's All About Android is very newsy with lots of hardware from the last week. It's been a never-ending avalanche of hardware.
I've heard it suggested that we should have a separate stream for you right after the Apple keynote address to do like a State of the Union response.
Hello, everyone. Look, no. It's okay. It's okay.
Maybe that will happen tomorrow night. You got to stop by. Check out all the Android goodness. And where can they find your shows again?
Twit.tv/AAA is the next show that's all about Android. And then twit.tv/Arena.
Fantastic. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, just reminding you, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep quiet.